Okay, welcome back, people. And of course, this is me again, Professor TOVANCHE. Today, as you can see, we're going to be talking about the struggles of Black folk in the North in the years after the Revolution into the 1800s. So, excuse me, by the early 1800s already, free Black people in the North are numbering in the tens of thousands, and they're going to continue to grow. You're going to see over time spurts of growth really over the remaining decades into the 21st century, really, or into the 20th century, I really should say. In the early 1800s, much like a lot of people later on, these people are going to go seek freedom in cities of the North. They're going to go to Philadelphia, New York, Boston, you name it. And they're going to work to make their lives and establish themselves as, quote, Americans. They're going to establish families for themselves. They're going to establish mutual aid self-help societies. They're going to establish churches and schools. For a very long time, we know that free Black people had long worked to build their lives and try to prove that they belonged. Unable to count on others, they're going to turn inwardly early on. They're going to establish Black organizations and a Black life and a Black identity and a Black culture in the North. A lot of this, of course, is going to be geared toward this idea of uplift, lifting themselves up. And so a major part of this uplift and this process of uplift is the formation of what are known as mutual aid societies. Societies that are basically built just so people can help each other. An example of this, and there were several, but an example of this is, as you can see there, the Free African Society established in Philadelphia in 1787, right? It's actually founded by two free men, a guy named Absalom Jones and Richard Allen, as you can see there on the plaque. And this mutual aid society, like others, are dedicated to supporting the well-being of Black folk. Others, of course, are going to crop up later, and they're going to be funded by members who pay dues. Not every Black person in the North is going to be wholly impoverished, right? Even those people who work and kind of working paycheck to paycheck, so to speak, they're also going to try to contribute because they're pooling their money and they're going to establish benefits. For example, money for widows and orphans. Disability payments. So if you get hurt, if you can't work, then the society will come together and help you. They're going to establish a healthcare sort of system for themselves. They're going to have education systems. They're going to establish things like burial insurance, right? Because it costs a lot of money to die properly, right? So basically what they're doing is establishing a social safety net. And they're often going to be working as part of or in tandem with Black churches. Black churches are going to be staples of the Black society in the North. Now, a lot of Black folk had been members of white churches for a very long time. For example, Allen, the guy who helped found that organization, the Mutual Aid Society. This guy had preached sermons for Black folk at white churches in Philadelphia, for example, St. George's Methodist Church, whatever. The point is, these were white churches. And in fact, at this place, white people and Black people worshiped together in the same building, but they were often segregated. So what Jones and Allen and other members of the Free African Society have to do is sit in the balcony. And it's not until like 1792 when Jones and other free Black men, Black folk, they actually decide, you know what, we're going to kneel in the whites only section of this church. And they refuse to move. But, I mean, this is supposed to be house of God and all that. These are Christian folk. They are forcibly removed by Christian folk, right? And what's interesting about this is not the sort of thing that we think of when we think of people in Black folk in the 1700s. We think of this kind of thing in the 1960s, right? The sit-ins at lunch counters, which we're going to talk about, right? But no, these people, they staged sort of a sit-in or a pray-in or a kneel-in, however you want to place it. They are sitting there kneeling in church and they refuse to leave. Of course, they're going to be removed. This is perhaps one of the first instances of what becomes known as civil disobedience, which we're going to talk more about later. Point is, because of instances like this, they realize that they have to found their own church. So Allen founds this Bethel African Episcopal Church, as you can see there, Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church. And he's going to serve as bishop himself. And a lot of people in the northern Black community are going to gravitate to this church. They're going to gravitate toward the Baptist religion. Now, these churches, by the way, like the African Episcopal Church, those churches are still there, and they still serve people today. There's a lot of churches like this at the time that draw on long-held that will draw on long-held traditions, and in fact, you're going to see that tradition, of course, present even today, and not just we're not just talking about a tradition that extends through time, but also other states and, in fact, other countries. And these churches will continue to welcome Black worshipers and others. Allen's church is one of these churches that actually comes together when colonization is actually something that a lot of white folk want to do. Remember colonization when they were trying to send people to Africa? Well, Allen's church comes together and they issue a resolution, which basically is just a statement of steadfastness. They say they will never separate themselves from their enslaved brothers and sisters. And so they call on people to come together as Black folk. And so Black churches are going to spread to other northern cities. They're going to spread to Boston, New York, and they're going to advocate for Black people. You're going to see a bunch of these churches really sort of coming together with these mutual aid societies. And they're going to hold meetings where they're going to talk about Black freedoms. They're going to talk against slavery, eventually more and more as the 18th century draws on. Black churches will really reinforce and reflect the voice of the Black community. Issues that are important to these people are, of course, freedom, but they also have more practical concerns. They want education for their children. They want solid employment. They want basically a strong financial well-being. But of course, they also want to be included as Americans. Now, these churches who were they weren't that were still looked down upon largely by the white community. These churches would unfortunately also within their own ranks sort of have this hierarchy. Even among Black churches, they only sometimes let women preach. Women outnumber men in Black churches just like today, but few women were allowed to preach. So it's interesting when you look at how sometimes the oppressed can also be the oppressor. So these Black men are establishing churches and being the heads of these churches. And of course, they are rightfully talking about the injustice heaped against them by white people. Yet at the same time, within their own community, they're actually not allowing Black women to have a particular place within at least an equal place. They have a place, but it's not equal to that of men. So they're going to establish mutual aid societies. They're going to establish churches. And of course, they're going to work to educate their children. But Black people are going to encounter all kinds of problems when it comes to education. Even in the North, public schooling is very, very scarce in the North because we're talking about the early 1800s. Public schooling was just getting off the ground in the early 1800s, and it's not until like the 1830s that it really starts to take off. So it's scarce generally. Several cities in the North, of course, begin public schooling in the early 1800s, like Boston and Philadelphia, but even in the North, most cities don't have them until later on. And so it's scarce. So those Black students who actually are able to attend a public school, and we're talking about public schools here, they're often shunned and treated horribly at these schools, not just by students, but by teachers. Because of this, a lot of well-meaning white folk would establish black schools. You're going to see Quakers and other abolitionists actually set up private schools. Now, unfortunately, these can be very expensive. The Pennsylvania Society, for example, as you can see here, the Pennsylvania Society for Promoting the Abolition of Slavery, it actually founds a school for black children in Philadelphia, but it charges tuition. And it refuses to actually fund any school that allows a black person to teach. So even though these are well-meaning white folk, right? They're extending education to the black community. They're still charging, and so it's going to be expensive, right? And they're not allowing black people to, in fact, teach at these schools. So what happens is that a lot of the black parents just say, you know what, we're going to send our kids to a different school, and they send them to Allen's church for the education. A lot of these schools, even those that those schools that are private, that are actually educating black children, they often are riddled with problems. I'll give you an example: low expectations. Low expectations. I'll give you an example. The New York Manumission Society, which we talked about before when I talked about Alexander Hamilton, the New York Manumission Society was founded in part by Alexander Hamilton after the American Revolution. It actually founds a school called the New York African Free School, right? And so most of the children at this school, are actually still enslaved people in New York State, still enslaved. It's a chance for their children to move up. However, the schooling there seems to have revolved more around the desire to control and watch black children and black folk. Even as it tried to uplift them, it tries to mold them into a certain form of person. Nothing wrong with that, but it seemed more about society in a form of self-defense in their minds than it was about the good of children. In fact, these children, after graduation, were forced into apprenticeships because the education was given to them. They are expected to work later on. And of course, these apprenticeships are going to come with skills and so forth, but these kids have no choice, really. A lot of these black schools are largely underfunded. They're short on books, they're short on supplies, and they're relying very often on tuition that most black folk just can't afford. A lot of these people can't afford to send their kids to school. A lot of these people have children, just like a lot of people at this time. It's not just black folk, right? But a lot of children work. They didn't go to school. This is the case for most people living at the time, but especially people of color and immigrants of all stripes. But even if they have an education, it's going to be very, very difficult for them to get a job. There's a lot of instances in the North where white men and white women will not work side by side with them or even within the same company. So a lot of bosses won't even hire them, not just because of their own prejudices, but because they know that they will lose white workers. And so a lot of students, black students in the North, who maybe could have gone to school and maybe made something of themselves. A lot of them, I mean, think about how discouraging that is when they're telling you, right, hey, even if you got a free ride to this school, right, but then, of course, you're going to have to be apprenticed. Or if not, after you graduate, now you might not be apprenticed, but who's going to give you a job, man? And it's not that people didn't find their way, but it's because that so many people were trying to succeed in this culture when at the same time, not a lot of people were allowing them to, especially within the black community. When they're trying to rise up, there's a lot of people who are going to discriminate. Let's be honest. So all these problems, of course, encourage black folk to want to start their own schools, rely on mutual aid. For them, education is seen as a way up, not just for individuals, but for the race as a group. And a lot of these black children who go to any number of these schools, a lot of them do end up succeeding. Black schools will attract a lot of Black women, those who will allow them to teach. Talented teachers, a lot of them come from middle class or sometimes even wealthy families. All of them pretty much deeply religious. The New York African School, for example, actually has some pretty good alumni. For example, a guy named Ira Eldridge. This guy was actually a very famous actor in the early 1800s. He's a celebrated Shakespearean actor who graces the stages in New York City, graces the stages, the London stage. He's the first Black actor to portray Othello on an English stage. And those of you who know, well, obviously Othello was a Black character, but he had never been played by a Black man before until this guy comes around. But it's not just that. Just like today, just like a lot of celebrities today, and you can think what you want on it, they feel that they have a platform. He speaks out. He speaks out against slavery, and he speaks out for racial equality. So he's not somebody who just takes his winnings and keeps them to himself, in a sense. He's trying to give back. Another example of someone who makes it out of one of these Black schools is a guy named McCune. Dr. James McCune Smith. He's going to be the first African American to earn a medical degree. When I say not the first Black man necessarily, but the first African American, right? And he actually, of course, doesn't earn it here. He has to go to Scotland, and he gets it from the University of Glasgow, by the way, where he graduates at the top of his class. And so this man, this brilliant, bright man, he has to actually leave the United States to actually achieve this accomplishment of being the first African American to get a medical degree. Graduates at the top of his class. He works in New York City as a doctor, and he works at the Colored Orphan Asylum, and he becomes a distinguished scholar of medicine and science. And he actually begins refuting this. There's an emerging science, and we're going to talk more about this later, but there's an emerging science here that talks about racial differences, especially with regard to intelligence. So in the early 1800s, and I think I mentioned this before, right, the last session, they're coming up with these ideas of the differences between race. They're making these biological arguments because they see things changing, and so they're looking for ways to distinguish themselves from Black folk. And so you're going to see a lot of people engaging in stereotypical thinking based on what they believe to be biological differences, especially regarding intelligence. So he refutes these things. He does writing on it, and he says, no, this doesn't make any sense. There's really no good evidence. And of course, modern scientists will tell you that's ridiculous. This guy is never admitted to the American Medical Association. But he doesn't only engage in this kind of thinking, right? He actually becomes a noted abolitionist. He will work with Frederick Douglass, who we'll talk about shortly. So some of these schools do graduate students who go on to have distinguished careers in various professions. They fight for abolitionism. They fight for equality and inclusion. They fight for this thing that I've already mentioned called uplift. But really, it is women that often go unnoticed, and women who are at the heart of the pursuit of social change. One of these women was a woman named Sarah Mapps Douglas. You see her there on the left. She takes a bunch of classes in medical sciences, and she teaches classes to Black women out of her home on medical education, medical stuff. But she doesn't just want to teach these women medical stuff for their own purposes, right? Because obviously there's not a whole lot of doctors that will often be wanting to actively, treat Black people. So in a sense, they have to help each other out or help themselves in their own homes. So there's that, but it's also, of course, this idea that maybe it will spark something in them if she teaches them something, spark a desire to learn more about this, and maybe go on to get some sort of medical degree of some sort. Of course, that would be very, 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 very difficult, almost impossible for a Black woman especially, right? A woman. Much more likely, that somebody like James McCune Smith would become a doctor than Sarah Mapps Douglas or someone who looked like her as a woman. But here's the thing. Douglas also calls for temperance. Temperance, as you may know, is this idea, it kind of means moderation. But the temperance movement that takes off in the early to 1800s and since into the 20th century, this is a movement designed to prohibit or to stall or to stop the consumption of alcohol. Temperance, Temperance, right? And so she pushes for temperance. And this temperance movement was huge. It was probably the major movement after abolitionism that women were involved in. She also calls for an end to prostitution, because prostitution was legal in lots of places. And she said, this degrades women, especially poor women, because what else do you have if you want to eat? And she also calls for better treatment for prisoners, better treatment for people who are mentally ill. So notice that these people have a variety of interests with regard to progressive change. Another woman that I want to point out to you is Maria Stuart. She also is someone who wants to uplift the morality of people. She talks about an end to gambling and an end to temperance as well, an end to drinking. And she specifically stresses education for girls. She believes that young Black girls should learn cleanliness and manners. Altogether, Douglas and Stuart, they believe that through teaching morality, you can change how white folk see the community. And so all of these things are going on in the early 1800s. And so by 1830 or so, the Black population of the North is becoming established, and their numbers are going to continue to grow. By 1830, you have about more than 200,000 Black people living in the North. You got to remember, most of these northern states had diminished the number of their slaves through manumission laws or through selling slaves to other areas. So most of the Black people by far living in the North are free. So you have a Black population growing. You have the Black population becoming established and clawing and scratching for a place at the table. But this is going to cause a backlash. Not a lot of people is going to like this. They're going to see how white abolitionists are sort of mixing with Black people, teaching them things. They're not really mixing with them. They're not friends necessarily. They're not hanging out with each other as family members, right? They're not intermarrying. That's not really happening. But for too many white folk in the North, for a lot of them, they're thinking this sort of coming together, even with regard to the benefit, giving a benefit as a Christian to Black folk, that's too close for comfort. They don't really like that this is happening. And so what's going to happen is that racial lines are going to be drawn very, very sharply by 1830. People look and they think, colonization is not working. We have more Black people than ever before in the North, and they're becoming established. So they turned in the North to discrimination. We talked about Black laws. So in the North, you have a variety of Black laws where you're going to see discrimination in things like jobs, housing, public accommodations, right? All these things that ring true for us in terms of the 1960s movement. These things are still going to be going on. So Black people in the North at this time, by 1830, they're working unskilled and underpaid labor. Black men tend to be cleaners and porters, right? Carriers of stuff. Women tend to be domestic servants. And then by the 1840s and 50s, you're going to see these people largely being displaced by another group, immigrants, especially the Irish, who are going to flow into the northern cities and establish themselves just above Black folk. Now, don't get me wrong, Irish people are treated horribly. They are. But as soon as the Irish get here, they just know in their minds that they're above these Black folk. And so immigrants will swell the northern population after the 1840s. And the percentage of Black people, the percentage is going to actually shrink because of all these immigrants coming in from Europe, mostly from Ireland in the 1840s. Later on, you're going to see a lot of Chinese people, but they're going to be mostly out west. And of course, in the late 1800s, you're going to see Italians and Polish and Russian and all these kind of people, right? So there's going to be a lot of competition for jobs, and things being what they are, they're going to establish themselves, the Irish, a little bit above Black folk. And so Black people are going to be hard put to actually make a really good living. Although some Black men do become wealthy. They own businesses and property. But they are the ones that are going to draw the most attention and draw the most hatred. Because in this society, a Black man with something is a danger to white society, as a lot of people see it. They're, of course, going to be also discriminated against in housing. Now, New York City has some very diverse areas. In some places in New York City, you see Black people and brown people and white people kind of hanging out here and there, just like you do today. But back in the day, you had that. But in most neighborhoods of Black cities, you're going to see a lot of segregation. I grew up in Cleveland. Cleveland is among the most segregated cities still. And it really starts way back in the day when Black people were sort of shunted into these pockets of the city's east side. In Boston, they had a neighborhood that they just called, and I don't want to say the word, but the N-word, right? N-word Hill, right? So they, and so when you're talking about, outright segregation in housing, and of course the worst housing, and so they're getting the least amount or they're getting the worst jobs and the worst housing accommodations. But even in public accommodations, they're actually segregated. Public accommodations, by the way, are of course private places that are open to the public. So for example, restaurants, right, hotels, these places. They might be open to the public, but they're not always open to certain kinds of people. And so you see this in the North, and there's a strong desire to keep people separate. And they're even trying to keep slaves out, as I mentioned, right? Not only are they trying to keep people separate within the state, but they're trying to keep as many slaves out as they can. They set up border patrols to keep the fugitives out. And of course, the legal system often leaves them out. There's a large disparity in the North when it comes to arrests, conviction, and imprisonment. By far, in huge numbers, Black men, especially men, are arrested, convicted, and imprisoned. And a lot of this, of course, is because the system is stacked against them. I mean, we don't need to talk about today. We're going to talk about that later. But look at what's going on there. And you have to wonder how much has changed and why it has or hasn't. But here, it was very, very clear that men were arrested on false pretenses, trumped up charges, or they were arrested for things that that white folk would not get arrested for under ordinary circumstances. So they're getting arrested, convicted, and imprisoned. And in almost all states in 1840, Black men can't vote, except for like Maine. This is going to change toward 1860. You're going to see more Black men voting by 1860. But by 1840 or so, only Maine allowed Black men to vote. In 1840, Black men can't sit on juries. They can't be lawyers. And now I'm talking about Black men because, in fact, women at this time of all colors aren't really going to do any of these things when it comes to voting or sitting on juries or being lawyers. So you're seeing also scientific explanations for racial differences, as I mentioned. Why all of this happening now? Why? Because there's a growing fear that racial barriers are being eroded and the free Black population is growing and people are afraid of what that means. And they're deathly afraid, which is why they engage in violence. There's all kinds of race riots. They call them riots, but they're really attacks. For example, they call this the Cincinnati Race Riot of 1829. In the summer of 1829, white people just rampage through the black neighborhood, and they actually eject about half the city's population of black folk. So white people just drive them out. Most of these people flee off to Canada. They call this a race riot, but that's not really what happened. This was an attack, and it was an atrocity. And these kinds of attacks happen in various northern cities, and they're going to happen all the way up through the Civil War, and of course, thereafter. They're going to happen in cities like Philadelphia, New York City, Boston, Rhode Island. And interestingly enough, all of this discrimination and all of these efforts to actually create a lesser sort of underclass, all of this is happening during what becomes known as the Age of the Common Man. The Age of the Common Man under Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson was known for democratizing, meaning making politics more democratic, for democratizing our politics, making them more democratic. And there is something to that, because by the 1830s, more white men are engaged in governing than ever before. By 1830s, they're voting and holding office in huge numbers. By the 1830s, already they have a universal right to vote without property restrictions around the country. So by the 1830s, there's this whole switch, this whole shift in this idea of freedom for white men, holding office, voting, and claiming property. More people are claiming this status as quote unquote American, but the black population is not really there yet. Not even those who are free can come close to this status. And there's a lot of black people in the North who begin by 1830 already to realize, if not before, that this idea of uplift is not just going to be, and it's not going to be enough. You can lift up the black race, but there's also, you can lift yourself up by your bootstraps sort of thing, but there's always going to be this context surrounding your daily life that's pulling you back, pulling you down. So what they decide to do is connect the uplift of free black folk to ending slavery. If you're going to change things, if you're going to change society, if you're going to help your community, you got to lift from the bottom. If you lift from the bottom, the top will also rise. And this is kind of something that Holloway says in his book as to why freedom for black people is important, because the idea is if you get freedom and equality for the people who historically have been at the bottom, then what does that mean for everybody else who has, to some degree or another, really been considered to be above them? Well, all boats rise. So because they realize something, that the oppression of one group allows the oppression of another, not just black people, but women too. So the process and the idea that oppression of a particular group because of who they are, if you allow that to exist, then what you're saying is that you can actually do that to others, not just this one group. So the idea is you uplift from the bottom, end slavery. And so they're going to engage in the abolitionist movements that had begun to develop in the North since the Revolution. Now, in the early 1800s, so right after the American Revolution, these early abolitionist efforts were geared more toward what was known as moral suasion. Moral suasion. This is where you can the idea is that you can convince people, and you can maybe convince Congress to end slavery. You can convince people and Congress that slavery is ungodly, it's immoral, and it's backwards in the nation founded on these lofty principles of freedom and equality. So these early efforts were pretty, they weren't very radical, right? They were pretty, excuse me. They were pretty modest, right? Moral suasion. Colonization was another thing. So as you're trying to convince people about the immorality of slavery, you're also trying to actually remove black folk from the country. Now, these early efforts are largely led by Quakers and other religious folk. And it's the Quakers, by the way, who start the Underground Railroad by about 1800. So before 1830, you do see an abolitionist movement sort of on the rise, or at least emerging. But it's not radical. It's not in your face. And they're talking about, the techniques are about changing hearts and minds. But by 1830, abolitionism in the North is going to rise and become more radical. There's reasons for this. By 1830, there's all these differences between North and South. We have our economies shooting in different directions. By the 1830s, the North is well on its way toward industrialization. There's a lot of stuff, canals are being built, roads are being built. Railroads come on the scene really strongly by the 1840s. Steamboats are already there. So you're seeing a divergence in their economies. You're also seeing a divergence in their societies, right? Because the people who, again, are living in either place are different from each other, and they hold different ideas about freedom. So this is driving North and South farther apart. And of course, there's westward expansion, as we've noted before. By the 1830s, U.S. settlers are all over Texas. We haven't talked too much about that. Texas doesn't actually get cut off from Mexico officially, to have the Texans say it, until 1836. But by the 1830s, there's a lot of slaveholders from the United States already flowing into Texas. And of course, as I mentioned before, slavery is moving westward. And of course, so it's not just the difference in economies and societies, ideas about freedom and westward expansion, but slave rebellions are a constant reminder. All of this convinces people that moral suasion alone can't work. You can't convince people of their values. A lot of these people have too much of an economic stake in slavery. A lot of people have a social stake in slavery. As I said before, I might be poor and white, but I'm white. So a lot of people won't be convinced by moral suasion alone. Even if you could convince people, how long is it going to take? And what do the slaves do in the meantime as they're suffering? And what does the country do as the nation is surging westward and everybody's moving westward, trying to establish themselves in the image of their home territory? So what's happening by the early 1830s is that you're going to see people becoming more firebrandish about it. Not really a word, I guess, but they're going to become firebrands, right? An example of this is a guy named William Lloyd Garrison, who publishes a newspaper called The Liberator. The Liberator. Liberator. Again, just because I put some things in there, but remember that everything is fair game here. So The Liberator is a newspaper that begins to be published around 1831. And William Lloyd Garrison is going to use very strong anti-slavery rhetoric, very strong language. He's going to talk about how slavery is evil, how it's unchristian, and he's going to denounce anyone who allows slavery to continue. He said it's not enough to be silent. You can't tell me you're neutral on this issue. This issue is much too important. It has to do with humanity, and it has to do with the future of the nation, and it has to do with the kind of country that we are supposed to be. In fact, he loves the Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal, but he denounces the U.S. Constitution. He does not like it at all. The U.S. Constitution he sees as a slave document. He also says, in addition to all this rhetoric, he says, look, the only way that slavery can be overthrown is through direct conflict, and we must do it now, not gradually, now. Now, you can imagine how Southerners see this. White Southerners, especially the planters, are going to blame Garrison for encouraging slave rebellions, especially Nat Turner's rebellion. which I hope you've seen already, the video. So William Lloyd Garrison is going to be a firebrand, but it's going to be women who would become the most vocal advocates of abolition among white folks, right? For example, the Grimke sisters, Angelina and Sarah. These women are daughters in the 1820s and 30s. They're daughters of plantation slave owners. They live in South Carolina. These were going to be the daughters of, they were the daughters of slave owners. These were going to be the wives of slave owners. That was supposed to be their due. But they turned their back on that for moral reasons. And in South Carolina, they're going to be shunned by friends, by all the white folk around them, and especially their families. How dare you turn your back on the South, on white folk, on your family? Well, they do, and they move to Philadelphia. Notice Philadelphia is one of these cities that Philadelphia is a strong, strong bastion of abolitionism. So they move to Philadelphia and they join forces with Garrison in Philadelphia. So what we're seeing in the 1830s, or right by the 1830s and into the 1830s, a growth in abolitionism from different quarters. You're also going to see free black folks themselves, as I said. Black people are sometimes going to join forces with people like Garrison, but often they strike out on their own. In fact, some white abolitionist organizations don't want to work with black abolitionists. Again, it's very complicated. They might want an end to slavery, but they don't see people as equal necessarily. A lot of them do. Garrison would say they are. A lot of these white abolitionists would say no. Anyway, Bishop Allen, remember him? He started that church. He actually starts a new movement in 1830 called the Black Convention Movement. So what he does is he calls for meetings and discussions, and they have these meetings and discussions on issues that are relevant to the black community. They talk about people who are free and their concerns, and they talk about people who are enslaved and obviously their concerns. They come together and they write resolutions in these organizations. And these are people who come from across the northern states over years. So this is a yearly thing, and they come from across the northern states, and they agree, they file resolutions to make a commitment to change. And then they go back to their home areas and they actually implement what they wanted, what they talked about. They send, they of course engage in education, they engage in the push for voting, they engage in abolitionism, and they do so in various ways. And of course, unfortunately, not all these people have a lot of power, so very often they have to actually call on prominent people in power to help them. Point is, look at all this agency going around, right? People are still within these circumstances trying to make a go of it for themselves. Now, within this Black Convention movement, not everybody agrees on what approach to take. They have these heated discussions. Some people push for peaceful change. For example, Frederick Douglass, which I will come back to. But others push for violence. There's a man named David Walker. A lot of these people are in your book, so make sure you read all that, because I'm only giving you sort of the quick and dirty on it. So David Walker was the son of a slave father and a free mother. Does that make him enslaved, or free? Anyway, David Walker lives in the North, and he pushes for an end to slavery. He pushes for the idea that black people must be accepted here. He pushes for freedom and equality. He writes a very famous appeal. Again, look at this in your book. He writes an appeal where he criticizes people. First of all, he criticizes white people. He's saying to them, you are not living up to the principles of the Declaration of Independence. He relies on revolutionary language of freedom and equality. He talks about republicanism, small r. Remember, republicanism just basically means the idea that government is representative. People are represented in government. He says all of these things that you have inherited, or these ideas, these lofty ideals that you have inherited from your forefathers, the framers of the Constitution, the founding fathers, all that. He says, you have turned your back on them because look around. So he criticizes white folk, but he really gives it to black people. He says, you need to stop giving in to the domination by white people. He says to slaves, rise up, strike for yourselves. He says, pick up what you can and strike back. And he says to free black people in the North. So he says, this, of course, to most of the slaves in the South, strike for your rights. But he also says to the free black people of the North, fight for your rights. Slaves in the South, fight. Free black people in the North, fight. And he naturally inspires a lot of people to do exactly that. He inspires black abolitionists. He inspires white abolitionists like Lloyd Garrison. And he's talking about not just abolitionism, but he's going beyond that. He's calling for civil rights. He's talking about equality. Already in the 1830s, he's not talking about just the end of slavery. He's talking about this land of equality that he says he was promised, and he was. But of course, these calls for violence, right, like David Walker's, these calls for violence are going to scare slave owners. Remember, slave owners have a strong personal interest in slavery, economic, social, political, all that. Slave owners have the strong interest in slavery. Southern states have this same strong interest in slavery. A lot of these state office holders are slave owners themselves. So what you're going to see in response to this abolitionism is a strong pushback. You're going to see, even among many white abolitionists, you're going to see a push for, colonization and so forth. But especially Southern whites are going to push for stricter slave codes. They're going to push for prohibitions on free black people. So because of people like Walker, who are doing the work that needs to be done, in the South, they're going to make him a villain. They actually put a bounty on his head. He becomes a wanted man. He's blamed, just like Nat Turner was blamed for just like Garrison was blamed for Nat Turner's rebellion. David Walker is going to be blamed for that as well. So Southern slave owners are riled up by Turner's rebellion. After Turner's rebellion, they really turn against people like Garrison, Walker, all these people who seem to be threatening what they stand for, their way of life. Now, I mentioned that they put a bounty on Walker's head. And by the way, Walker is found dead in the doorway of his home some years later. We're not sure what happened to him. It's probable that he died from tuberculosis, though we're not sure. It's possible he died from poison. We just don't know. So you see a variety of people rising up in the 1830s. Garrison, Grimke sisters, right? People like Allen and David Walker, all these people. But it's going to be those who actually fled the South who will bring the most powerful voice to abolitionism. These people are going to electrify abolitionism in the North. One of these people is a woman named Sojourner Truth. She was born Isabella Balfour. She lives in New York State. She actually lives about 90 miles from New York City. And she lived there at the time that New York State was slowly outlawing slavery. So in the early 1800s, her owner consistently promises to free her and her children over and over again. Finally, she just stops waiting. In 1826, she just runs. She flees. In fact, she says, I didn't run, I walked. She said running would have seemed wrong, so I walked, which was right. She flees with her baby girl in her arms after years of being promised freedom, and she even has to leave behind several children. When she makes it north, she's going to be helped by good, well-meaning white folk to gain her freedom. So she gets her freedom. Eventually, she sues in court to get her children. She does succeed in winning the freedom of at least one. This fellow named Peter, I think, was sold illegally under New York's slave law. And so she goes to court and she wins. The point about her, of course, is that she is a woman who lived through the indignities of slavery, who makes it north, and then over the years, she becomes an influential person. She embraces Christianity. This is the time of the Second Great Awakening. She changes her name to Sojourner Truth, sometime in the 1840s, I think. Sojourner Truth. What's a sojourner? A traveler. And the way I interpret this, I could be wrong. I've never really looked into this, but I'm thinking that she is a traveler seeking the truth. Sojourner Truth. And of course, the change in name is indicative of something. It is indicative of how she is putting together for herself. She is establishing. She's becoming herself. She changes her name. She takes off Isabella Balfrey. She takes off slavery and decides, this is who I am. I'm somebody new. I'm not who you told me I am. She's not going to go by the slave name. And then she becomes a very influential speaker in the 1840s and 1850s. She becomes a speaker on abolitionism and women's rights. And she tours the North, debating and beating men. Very outspoken person, not just on abolitionism, but on women's rights. Perhaps the most famous one, maybe, is this guy, Frederick Douglass, who escaped slavery in Maryland. He escaped sometime in like 1838, whatever, doesn't matter. 1830s. And when he escapes slavery in Maryland, he lives in various cities of the North. He goes to the North, he settles down with a new wife, and he begins to lecture on the evils of slavery, and he preaches Christianity. Eventually, in 1845, he will write the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass. This is a very powerful, sorrowful account of the dehumanization and brutality of slavery. It was so eloquently written, it was so beautifully written, that people thought it was a hoax. They said, there's no way this was written by a black man, let alone a slave. But then people would come from miles around to hear him speak, and they would be blown away. The man was amazing. He was bright, just brilliant. You know, by 1846, he has enthralled people, right? He's basically charmed people around him. English supporters, especially, they come together and they buy his freedom. English people come together, buy his freedom, and then later on they will fund his newspaper. He becomes likely the most influential black abolitionist. And he will become, in part, that's because he becomes close with Abraham Lincoln. So Lincoln's on our stage now, sort of. Another very, very famous person, Harriet Tubman. Enslaved in Maryland, she runs away time again, and then finally in like 1840s, she runs away permanently. And she tells a very powerful tale of the brutality, the beatings, the starvation. A lot of these slaves tell stories of being starved purposely and dehumanized. Of course, she becomes famously the conductor of the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad, of course, is not a real railroad, although it seems to have been depicted as such in that recent, is it Netflix special or series? I don't know. I haven't seen it, but I saw images of like a real railroad. But the Underground Railroad, of course, was a network of safe houses and trails that people would use to escape slavery. They would flow into the north. They would go into Canada. and even into Mexico. So they're going in both directions. This is a network of black and white folk who come together and put their lives and their money and everything on the line to help people escape slavery. Harriet Tubman, she actually makes some 19 or so trips into the South to bring people up. As a free, as a woman who is free, I mean, she runs away. She still goes into the South to help others. And she carries a gun. Why does she carry a gun? Well, this woman was serious about what she did. Yeah, she might carry a gun for self-defense. It would be, of course, very, very scary for her to actually kill a white man. I imagine in this society. So I'm sure that's something that she considered. But she also carried a gun because you got to remember, it's really, really difficult to run away. A lot of these people who run away are often caught. And so they're afraid. So imagine Harriet Tubman comes to get you and you're about 2 miles out of town and you're thinking about getting caught. You might just decide, you know what, Harriet, thank you, but I'm going back. What's she going to do? She's going to pull the gun on you. And she's going to say, nah, you're going to keep going. Why? Because this is not about you anymore. This is about you, but it's about slavery. This is about me. It's about the person who's waiting for you, who's also put his life on the line. It's about the man who is going to ride us over that river in that boat, and about that woman down the road, white, black, whomever, because that's the way it was, a woman who's going to put you up at her own expense and who is already gone out of her way. People have gone out of the way for you. Now, it's really, really hard to tell how many people actually made it out through the Underground Railroad. We're going to talk about the Underground Railroad later. The point is this. Southerners believed that they were just bleeding slaves, in a sense, meaning that slaves were just flowing out of the South through the Underground Railroad. There are some historians who say, the number of people who fled through the Underground Railroad numbers in the thousands. I don't know about that. There are certainly a lot of people who ran away, probably in the thousands, but through the Underground Railroad and who actually made it, best evidence we have suggests several hundred people made it. Hard to say. The point is that there's a mythology surrounding this. We can't be sure, but it lives in our imaginations. Can't be sure how many actually fled, but it lived in the imaginations of Southerners who were really afraid of losing their slaves. And they're going to crack down even more later on because of the Underground Railroad, or what they think about it. So she becomes the conductor, and she's called Moses among her people. And those of you who know anything about the Old Testament, right? Moses, of course, is the guy who, according to the Bible, leads the Jews out of slavery from Egypt. People talk about her astounding daring and how she, of course, avoids slave patrols. She avoids the bounty hunters, the slave catchers, the hunting dogs, and is able to survive somehow in nature by her own wits. I've not yet seen the movie Harriet, but I keep meaning to. Tubman is one of the many who carry with them the personal agonies of slavery. But they're only, Tubman and these people, they're only some of the many who ran away, who ran away and made it. There are many, many people who didn't make it. And of course, it's going to be easier for slaves living in the states close to the north, right? Virginia, Maryland, Kentucky, Delaware. And so you're going to see most runaways coming from these areas. That's really, really difficult. It's going to be really difficult to get up from, Georgia or Mississippi to the north, although those are most likely going to go southward, and they did, into Mexico. So by the 1830s, a lot of white folk are afraid because of the changes that they see happening. They fear abolitionism because it could mean equality. They fear abolitionism because they fear that maybe it will cause a fracturing of the Union. And so, even in the North, a lot of people push back against abolitionism. Mobs will sometimes harass or beat abolitionists, black and white. And it gets worse than that. In 1837, a pro-slavery mob storms the newspaper office of this guy named Elijah P. Lovejoy. This guy's an abolitionist living in Illinois. He prints a paper, and the mob doesn't like it. The mob marches on his place, torches everything, and they shoot him 5 times with a shotgun. The killing of Lovejoy is seen as a turning point by a lot of people. It's the first time that a white man has died in the fight to end slavery at the hands of other white men. So, white man being killed by other white men in the name of slavery. So this is a turning point. It's also a turning point because it really enrages a lot of abolitionists. There's a man named John Brown who stands up after the killing of Lovejoy and swears to God that he will devote his life to destroying slavery, whatever it takes. He says he will destroy it, and even if it destroys him and his family. We're going to see this guy again, so pay attention to John Brown. Now, that's the North. I mean, of course, in the South, there's a lot of consternation as well, a lot of worry. We've seen already that in the South, planners have fought to protect slavery. They've used the gag rule, right? They have passed state laws outlawing any speech against slavery on the streets. They have pushed for westward expansion and the creation of slave states out west. They've pushed for this idea of states' rights. But now, by the 1830s, mid-1830s, they're really becoming more and more determined to protect slavery. Why? Because of the slave revolts, the runaways, and the movement toward abolitionism, not just in the North, but around the world. By the 1830s, Mexico has outlawed slavery. England outlaws it in 1833. France is moving on its way. Already, the international slave trade has been banned in 1808 by the United States and England, the international slave trade. In fact, England does us one better. After they abolish the international slave trade in 1808, they establish, and the British Navy is the biggest navy in the world at this time, they establish a special squadron of Navy ships whose job it is solely to patrol the waters of the Atlantic to make sure that people are not being taken from Africa anymore. So the writing is on the wall. The world seems to be going one way, and the South seems to be going another. They're feeling threatened, and they go on the offensive, and they will re-envision slavery in a very disgusting way. I don't know how else to put it. So they're going to come up with a new way of defending slavery. Let me first tell you about the old way. The old way of defending slavery was more traditional in the sense that a lot of people, when they talked about slavery, they thought it's temporary. It's going to die out sometime. They're almost apologetic about owning slaves. Sorry, but I mean, what am I to do, kind of thing. They see this as temporary, slavery as temporary, and they kind of see it as a necessary evil. It is what it is. They're here. I'll give you an example. Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson says slavery is wrong, but it should be kept in place. He says, by keeping slavery in place, we avoid a race war. And we take care of Black people who are inferior. That's how he thinks. It's this idea of a race war that's interesting. He says this really kind of folksy, you got this kind of folksy analogy. He says, holding slavery, which is what we should do. We should hold slavery just as you would hold a wolf by the ears who's trying to eat your face, basically. You don't like it. You don't like that it's there, but you better not let go. That's how he analogizes to slavery. Point is, that's the old way of defending slavery. It's temporary. We're kind of sorry they're there. It's kind of a necessary evil. We don't want to actually do, we don't want to move this at all, because who knows what's going to happen if we end slavery. Well, that's the old way. They have a new way, and it becomes known as the pro-slavery argument into the 1830s, where they make these series of arguments. They say slavery is civilized, it's God's work, it's beneficial to everyone, it's moral, and it's natural. So, for example, in the 1830s, a guy named Thomas Dew, who's a professor of history, and he's president of the College of William and Mary. He's a strong pro-slavery advocate. He's a professor of history. He actually was instrumental in crushing any efforts to end slavery in Virginia after Nat Turner's rebellion. You may recall that after Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831, Virginia was close to outlawing slavery because it feared similar revolts. But they killed that. They squashed that idea, and what they did, of course, was they turned it up a notch. They actually raised the stakes, tightened down everything, made things worse. And this guy, Thomas Dew, was instrumental in getting that, and actually ensuring that slavery stayed in place. Well, this guy, Thomas Dew, he argues that ancient history and the Bible show slavery is a marker of civilization. Romans did it, the Greeks did it. So in fact, Southern planters are the guardians of civilization. So he's taking this historical view, guardians of civilization. So the planters of the South should be lauded. They should be praised. But it doesn't stop there. A guy named George McDuffie, also in the 1830s, he basically says, this is God's work, right? He's a South Carolina legislator. And he writes this very famous, becomes famous among historians, very famous tract, article where he says, which he calls The Natural Slavery of the Negro. And the title doesn't matter, but here's the point. He says that no human institution is more consistent with God's will than slavery. Black people are naturally inferior. Therefore, they must be cared for, and God has given that task to us. He goes on to say something else, which is pretty disturbing to a lot of my students. And he says, look, Black people are not saved. God created man in his own image. God is white. Therefore, Black people were not created in God's image. And so they don't deserve the grace of God. And so what God did was put us here to take care of them. So planters are, in fact, the instruments of God here. And this religious argument is really, really powerful. And of course, it's bolstered by this idea. We talked about, the sons of Ham, right? The sons of Ham. Ham was one of Noah's sons. And according to some interpretation of the Bible, the sons of Ham were Africans and were destined to be enslaved forever. So there's other parts of the Bible that seem to support slavery. And that's the Old Testament. And there's a lot of places in the Old Testament where slavery seems like it's not, it's not a huge deal, to put it quite badly. I'm getting really tired. Sorry, I'm exhausted. So I'm struggling here. I appreciate you bearing with me. But the Old Testament has if you look through it, you're going to see many instances in which slavery seems to be condoned, or at least not criticized. That's the Old Testament. And then you want to talk New Testament? Well, Jesus never said we couldn't do it, is what they say. People will say, well, Jesus came to change everything and so forth, to change the old ways. And he could have actually told us about this, and he never did. So, it's all good to go. Slavery is godly. And they go on. They say slavery benefits everyone, the enslaved people as well as the enslavers. A guy named John C. Calhoun. This guy is a former vice president of the United States and later on a South Carolina senator. But he's a vice president of the United States earlier, like the 1820s. But in 1837, he writes this very famous tract called Slavery, a Positive Good. Slavery, a Positive Good. This is one of the most famous expositions of pro-slavery documents, where he says in Slavery is a Positive Good. Slavery, a Positive. He says, slavery is good for the enslavers. Why? Because it minimizes class conflict. He says, look at the North. In the North, because workers want labor rights, workers want higher pay, workers want better working conditions. They're already starting to fight for this in the early 1800s, by the way. Because of all that, it creates a destabilized society. There's conflict. He says in the South, we have none of that. Slaves know they don't have any rights. So that means that there's no class conflict. Everybody knows their place. He also says that it benefits the economy of the enslaving nation. He says every nation needs a stable labor source. That's slavery. You don't want an unstable labor source. You want people to work. What better way to do it than to enslave them, he says. He also says that slavery promotes innovation, advancements in society and in civilization. So, for example, he will say, as slaves work and do the hard drudge work, it frees up white people to advance their society. He says that's how the Greeks, in fact, established their own society, and the Romans. They built it on the back of slaves. That's how you do it. And then he goes on, he says, this is good for the enslaved too, because they're cared for. They're given food and shelter and clothing, and they're cared for in their old age. Of course, he's way overstating this. But he's trying to make a point, and that is they're cared for. We care for our slaves here, not like those poor white Irish immigrants of the North who are fighting for scraps at the table. So look at these arguments about civilization and God and who it benefits. And then a guy named George Fitzhugh goes on to say it's morally responsible to hold slaves. This guy is a lawyer and a social theorist. He writes a book called Slavery Justified. And he says black people are like children. They must be led. They must be cared for. They must be civilized. And so he's making a sort of sociological argument here. Notice all these different arguments. They all point to the same thing. And these people were learned people. These were educated folk. Educated according to the time. And lastly, and I don't know which one of these is worse, but this one gets my attention. He says human bondage of black people is natural. Now, this is a response to someone. It's natural, he said. Who have we talked about with regard to what is natural? Specifically, natural rights. Think about it. Remember John Locke? John Locke said we all are born with natural rights, life, liberty, and property, he says. Well, a guy named Samuel Cartwright comes around and says, well, people are born with natural rights, but black people don't have them. This guy's a doctor. He's a physician. And he argues that black people are naturally, biologically biologically inferior to white people. And he gives this weird example. He says black people consume less oxygen than white folk. This is kind of confusing. You'd think that an organism that consumes less oxygen or needs less oxygen to survive is maybe a more robust individual, right? Maybe more advanced. And so this is what a lot of my students will ask me. Well, isn't that what it means? And I say, well, look at it from their point of view. A lot of these people, even though they know that black folk are not animals, they know this, they think of them as such. And so this helps them think of them as such. Think about, an organism who is so strong that he needs less oxygen. It's almost like an organism that is stronger than you, like a horse. In a sense, they're making comparisons that are animalistic in nature. And so he says slavery, because of these biological differences, slavery is a natural state for them. And he says, and he goes on into, and people, of course, are going to ask him, well, why do they run away? Right? Well, he says, running away, any form of slave resistance, by the way, he says any form of slave resistance is a form of mental disorder. He says running away was a mental disorder. He called it drapetomania. It doesn't matter. The point is, he says that running away among slaves was caused by a mental disorder because their natural state is to be enslaved. And he says other things like this, and that I don't really want to go into anymore because this is just way too much. Now, I should tell you, I'm not going to ask you what each man of these said, right? Which of these men said what thing, right? I only put these names up there so if you're curious and you want to investigate some of these things because it's just so ridiculous, then I would encourage you to do that. But really think about these arguments that they're making. They're making arguments about civilization, right? What is the correct civilization? What does God want? Who does slavery benefit? Is it moral? Is it natural? And we already know how they're answering these questions. So it doesn't really, doesn't really matter who said what. John C. Calhoun is an important one, but I'm not going to ask you what Thomas Dew said necessarily. So these arguments that are encapsulated within this larger pro-slavery argument, they're strong, and they spread throughout the country. They spread to people in power, politicians, academics, ministers. And in fact, I would say that there's some residue still there today from these arguments. They did a lot of damage because I think some of these arguments are still accepted today. If I'll give you the example of who it benefits. There's a guy named John Spencer? Hang on. No, John Spencer was on West Wing. Richard Spencer. I had to look it up real quick. Look up Richard Spencer and what he thinks about slavery. Richard Spencer is an educated man, I suppose. He went to Notre Dame University, and he has become the leader of what has become known as the alt-right movement, the alternative right, the alt-right movement. And this movement can, of course, be defined by in various ways. Some people say white supremacists. They might deny that. They call themselves white nationalists, and of course, you can debate that. The point is, there are people like Richard Spencer around who believe in these arguments. I won't say that he believes in them all, but I can tell you I've seen him speak on who slavery has benefited. It might be of interest for you to take a look at that. There's a clip on YouTube. Richard Spencer interview with Gary Young. Gary Young, and his last name is spelled Young, like not old, but young, with an E at the end. Gary Young with an E at the end. And he's a British journalist. He's a black man. and he interviews Richard Spencer. You can find that on YouTube if you're interested. Point being that a lot of these ideas are still with us. Okay, I am done. Like, I am really done because I'm so tired. I hope this made sense to you. I struggled through this, so I thank you for bearing with me. I've been struggling through the last couple of times. And again, if you have any questions, please ask, and I'll try to clear up any doubts or any questions that you might have. All right. Thank you. Take care. Be well. Be good.